All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a topic today that's super relevant if you're prepping for the UPSC exams.
Yeah, absolutely. This one's been making headlines, and it could definitely show up in your prelims or mains.
We're talking about the arrest of women at night.
It's a really interesting legal area with some recent developments that are important to understand.
So imagine this, right? You've got a serious crime that happens at night, and the main suspect is a woman.
Okay.
Should the police have to wait until sunrise to arrest her?
That's a tricky one.
It is, and that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today.
Okay, interesting.
Specifically, how the Bharatiya Nagarik Suraksha Sanhita, the BNSS of 2023, deals with this whole situation.
All right, so we're talking about the updated law,
Yep, exactly. And in particular, we'll be focusing on Section 43.5 of the BNSS.
which, if I'm remembering correctly, that basically replaces Section 46.4 from the old Code of Criminal Procedure.
It's essentially the updated version. And the law is meant to protect women. But what happens when, strictly following the rules might actually get in the way of justice?
Yeah, that's the dilemma, isn't it? Balancing protection with effective law enforcement.
It is. It's a real balancing act. So let's break down what these safeguards actually are.
Okay, sure.
What does the BNSS actually say about arresting women at night?
Well, there are two main points, really. First, the BNSS says women can't be arrested between sunset and sunrise.
Okay, so there's a time restriction.
Right, unless there are what they call exceptional circumstances.
Exceptional circumstances.
And second, even in those exceptional cases, a woman police officer needs to get written permission from a magistrate before making the arrest.
So there's that extra layer of approval needed.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense when you think about the potential for abuse of power.
Absolutely. It's about protecting women.
But then, what counts as an exceptional circumstance?
Yeah, good question.
It seems like that could be open to a lot of interpretation, right?
It definitely is, and it's actually something that the Madras High Court addressed in a recent ruling.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they weighed in on this whole exceptional circumstances issue and came to a pretty significant decision.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting, especially for our UPSC aspirants out there.
Definitely.
So, what did the Madras High Court say? What was their take on this?
Well, they decided that Section 46(4) of the CRPC, and by extension, Section 43 of the BNSS, is what's called directory, not mandatory.
Okay, hold on. I think we need to break that down a bit. Directory versus mandatory. What's the difference?
Yeah, you're right. Those legal terms can be a little confusing.
A little bit.
It's kind of like this, think of a mandatory rule like a red light at a traffic signal. You absolutely cannot go through it.
Okay, got it. You have to stop.
But a directory rule, that's more like a yellow light. Proceed with caution, but, you can go through if the situation really demands it.
Okay, so there's some wiggle room with the directory rule.
Exactly.
So, in essence, what the court is saying is that these safeguards are important, but they shouldn't completely prevent the police from doing their job.
Right, especially in urgent situations where public safety might be at risk.
Makes sense, because there are going to be times when sticking rigidly to procedure could actually be harmful.
Exactly, like in cases of, say, a violent assault or a kidnapping.
Right, those situations where every second counts.
Right, where waiting for sunrise or getting that written permission could let the suspect get away and potentially cause more harm.
So the court is acknowledging that real-world practicality needs to be considered.
They're recognizing that police officers have a duty to the public, and sometimes following the letter of the law could actually obstruct that duty.
So we have this time restriction, the need for magistrate approval, and now the court's saying it's directory, not mandatory. But if the law doesn't clearly define what an exceptional circumstance is,
Yeah.
couldn't that lead to problems, like inconsistencies in how the rule is applied?
Oh, absolutely. That's a valid point. What one officer might see as exceptional, another might see as pretty routine.
Exactly, and that seems like it could open the door for misuse, right?
It's a valid concern, and the court actually acknowledged that as well. They recognize that without a clear definition, there's definitely potential for inconsistencies and even abuse of the provision.
Okay, so the court recognizes the potential problems, the vagueness, the possibility of misuse.
Yes.
To really understand this, maybe we should look back a bit, see how this provision came about in the first place.
Yeah, I think looking at the historical context could be helpful here.
So where did this idea of safeguards for arresting women at night originate? What's the backstory?
Well, it actually goes back a while, several decades even.
Oh, wow. Further back than I would have thought.
It starts with the 135th Law Commission report back in 1989. They were the first to recommend that women shouldn't be arrested between sunset and sunrise unless there were special circumstances.
So that's where the idea first took root.
Right. And then the 154th Law Commission report in 1996, they came along and they basically echoed that same recommendation.
Okay, so there was this growing recognition that there needed to be some protection for women during the arrest process.
Exactly, a recognition of the potential vulnerabilities.
And those recommendations eventually led to the inclusion of Section 46(4) in the CRPC, which happened in 2005.
Precisely. And it's interesting to note that even the Supreme Court has looked at this issue.
Oh, really? What was their take on it?
They've actually observed that strictly following this rule could lead to practical difficulties in certain situations, which, kind of aligns with what the Madras High Court recently decided as well.
So even at the highest court, there's been an acknowledgement that there are these real-world complexities that the law needs to grapple with.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got this historical backdrop, the Madras High Court ruling, this ongoing ambiguity surrounding exceptional circumstances. What does this all mean moving forward?
Right, good question. How does this impact things on the ground?
Exactly. What's the practical effect of all of this?
Well, the Madras High Court, they didn't just highlight the issues, they actually offered a solution too. They specifically directed police authorities to come up with clear guidelines.
Guidelines for what exactly?
Defining what constitutes an exceptional circumstance, trying to make that clearer.
So trying to remove some of that vagueness, make things more concrete.
Exactly. The idea is that if you have a standardized definition that all officers can follow, well, then it could help prevent misinterpretations or abuse of the provision.
Yeah, because right now it's kind of like, exceptional circumstances, whatever an individual officer decides it is.
Right, exactly. So having clear guidelines would add a level of, well, accountability.
It's about ensuring that the safeguards are actually doing what they're supposed to do.
That's the goal, yeah.
So we've been talking about this from a sort of legal perspective, but I want to bring it back to our listeners, especially those who are preparing for the UPSC exams.
Sure, yeah.
What are the key takeaways for them? Like, how does this whole issue connect to their preparation?
Well, I think this is a perfect example of a topic that could easily come up in either the prelims or the mains.
Oh, absolutely.
It touches on so many crucial themes, like women's rights,
Right. Absolutely. That's a huge
the criminal justice system as a whole,
Yeah.
the evolution of laws and how they're interpreted.
And how they're applied in practice.
Exactly. And, that constant balance between individual rights and what society needs.
It's almost like a real-life case study that's playing out in the headlines, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's a good reminder for UPSC aspirants that, the exam isn't just about memorizing a bunch of facts.
Right. It's not just rote learning.
No, it's about understanding how these different legal provisions interact, how judgments actually shape how the law is practiced, and how to think critically about complex situations.
Yeah, it's about being able to analyze, to form an informed opinion.
Exactly. That's what they're looking for, the analytical mindset. And this case really highlights how dynamic our legal system is. How it's constantly adapting and evolving based on new challenges and interpretations.
Right. It's not static. It's always changing, which is why it's so important for UPSC aspirants to keep themselves updated on these developments.
Absolutely. So it's important to understand that, yes, this ruling clarifies that the provision is directory, not mandatory.
Right. There's that flexibility now.
But it doesn't mean that police officers can just ignore it completely.
Okay, so it's not a free pass.
No, not at all. In fact, the ruling actually emphasizes that the officer who makes the arrest, they have to be able to justify why they didn't follow those safeguards.
So they need to be able to explain their actions.
Exactly, and be ready to have their decisions scrutinized. The court is basically saying, yes, you can deviate from the rule if the circumstances really require it, but be prepared to explain why you did it.
There needs to be a solid justification.
Right, and it needs to hold up under scrutiny.
Which makes sense, because you want to maintain that balance, between having the flexibility to respond to different situations, but also ensuring accountability.
Precisely. Recognizing that real-world situations can be messy and they don't always fit neatly into what the law says.
Right. And that call for clear police guidelines, that's an attempt to bring more consistency and clarity to those judgment calls.
Exactly, to minimize the possibility of misuse or misinterpretation.
Okay, so this whole conversation, it raises a really interesting question, not just for law enforcement, but for society as a whole.
Okay, what's that?
As technology keeps advancing, how do we make sure our laws keep up?
That's a big one, yeah. How do they stay relevant and effective in the face of new challenges?
Exactly, because the world is changing so rapidly.
It is, and it's a question that lawmakers and legal experts are going to have to keep grappling with.
Definitely. But I think for our listeners, especially those who want to join the civil services, this highlights how important it is to have these discussions.
Absolutely, to keep thinking critically, to be willing to adapt to new situations.
Because the law isn't set in stone.
No, it needs to be flexible and responsive to keep pace with the world around it.
Okay, so we've explored the legal details, the history behind this provision, and what this ruling might mean in practice. But there's another layer to this, right?
There is.
We need to talk about the potential consequences. How might this ruling affect women's safety moving forward?
Yeah, that's a crucial question. We'll need to dig into that.
So we've been really digging into this issue of arresting women at night and, how this Madras High Court ruling kind of adds a whole other layer to this whole discussion.
It does. There's definitely a lot to think about, especially when it comes to how this might affect women's safety.
Yeah, that's the big question, right?
It is. I mean, on the one hand, you could see this ruling as kind of giving law enforcement more power, to act quickly when a delay could put public safety at risk or let a suspect get away.
Okay, so more immediate action.
Right, which could, in theory, help deter crimes against women and just create a sense of security, knowing that the law can respond effectively.
But then doesn't that also raise the possibility of, misuse?
It does. That's a valid concern for sure. Could this ruling actually make women more vulnerable in some situations, especially given, existing power imbalances?
Right. And the fact that exceptional circumstances clause is still a little vague.
Exactly. And that's where the court's directive for clear guidelines is so important.
Because that's what's supposed to prevent that risk.
It's supposed to, but whether it's effective or not really depends on how those guidelines are actually implemented and enforced.
It all comes down to implementation, doesn't it?
A lot of the time it does.
And this brings up another important point, I think, especially for those prepping for the UPSC. This whole issue, it's really a microcosm of a much larger debate, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It gets to the heart of this ongoing conversation about women's rights in India.
Exactly. And it forces us to think about those really tough questions, like how to balance individual rights with the need for effective law enforcement, and how to make sure laws that are designed to protect vulnerable groups, how to make sure they aren't being misused or misinterpreted.
Because that happens sometimes, unfortunately.
It does. And this case, it's a good reminder that legal reforms, it's an ongoing process.
It's always evolving.
Constantly changing, adapting to new challenges, new interpretations. And for those studying for the UPSC, this case really shows how important it is to stay informed, to think critically, to be able to express your own views on these complex issues.
Because the UPSC isn't just looking for you to regurgitate facts, right?
No, they want to see that you understand the nuances, the different perspectives, the potential consequences of legal developments like this one.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main things our listeners should take away from this?
Well, first, it's important to remember what that Madras High Court ruling actually said.
Okay, refresh our memory.
It clarified that the provision on arresting women at night, it's directory, not mandatory, which gives police officers more flexibility in exceptional circumstances.
Right, it's all about finding that balance, like we were talking about, protecting women, but also making sure law enforcement can do its job effectively.
Exactly. And second, we can't forget that exceptional circumstances, that term is still pretty vague.
Which raises concerns.
It does, about the potential for misuse. That's why those police guidelines are so crucial, to provide clarity and make sure everyone's accountable.
Yeah, because we want those safeguards to actually mean something, right?
Absolutely. They need to be more than just symbolic. And finally, this is especially for our UPSC folks out there, this case is a perfect example of how legal interpretations can actually change the way laws are used in the real world.
Yeah, it's not just theoretical, it has real-world impact.
And it shows how dynamic our legal system is and how important it is to stay on top of these developments.
It's a real-life case study that you could easily see on your exam. So make sure you really understand the ins and outs of this issue. The arguments for and against the ruling, what the potential consequences might be for women's safety, for the criminal justice system, for everything.
And if you want to do a little more research on this case, there are some great articles on Indian Express and Live Law. We'll make sure to put those links in the show notes.
Perfect. So everyone can check those out. And remember, knowledge is power, especially when you're preparing for the UPSC. So keep learning, keep those brains engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
And if you have any thoughts about this case, any questions, anything you'd like to add, please leave a comment below. We always love hearing from our listeners and getting those discussions going.
Absolutely, we love to hear what you think. And if you found this deep dive helpful, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more UPSC content, and share this with your fellow aspirants. Until next time, good luck with your prep, everyone.